Welcome to this video on Nimzo-Indian patterns. Many of you asked me to make a video about Nimzo-Indian patterns. Here we go. I very much believe in this idea-based opening preparation. We need to learn typical, recurrent, and important middle game patterns and chunks to fully absorb and deeply understand our openings. Nimzo-Indian starts with these moves, as most of you know, of course, yeah? Popularized by Aaron Nimzovic already. Bishop b4 signifies Nimzo-Indian. I always like to start with the bigger picture. If you have to summarize the philosophy of the Nimzo-Indian defense, let's say in 2 sentences, what would you say? Let's start with the big picture first, folks, because that's important for me to have a basic stance and basic understanding of the general gist of our openings. To my mind, well, we are welcoming exchanging our bishop for the knight, so we want to give the bishop pair for the opponent, but our basic claim will be their bishop pair will be ineffective. Also, double pawns, right? If you think about the basic spirit of Nimzo-Indian defense, we are welcoming to give up our bishop pair to double their pawns on the queen side, to fix them as targets and later exploit them in the middle game or in the end game. We don't lose time as well. We rapidly get the pieces out and maybe castle short ASAP in this position. So these are the justifications of why a person plays the Nimzo. I like those strategic openings because we are creating instant imbalances on the board. We give up the bishop pair, but we also give double pawns to the opponent in many Nimzo lines. And this, to my mind, makes an opening really interesting because there's always give and takes. There are always trade-offs. This also lends nicely to such strategic pattern videos because I will give you some tools of how to navigate those imbalances and how to intensify the imbalance that favors you. That's my goal with this video. Having said that, let's again look at the bigger picture. There are so many potential pawn formations that Nimzo-Indian defense can give you. For example, let's have a look at this line, folks. E3, Hübner Variation. In today's video, we will analyze the Hübner Variation with early c5, but let's look at the main lines that we castle short with black. Okay, after bishop b3, c5, very typical Nimzo-Indian move. Here, let's say white goes knight e2 and don't let black to double their pawns. Here, we are seeing one form of transformation of the pawn structure. Look at this, guys. C takes d5. First, you take on d4, and in this structure, it's white who is getting the IQP. Isolated queen's pawn. That's just one of those potential transformations of the pawn structure that Nimzo-Indian can give you. Or after c5, let's look at the move knight f3, folks. d5, castle short. Here, if we want, we can make this transformation of the pawn structure. Can you see it? Takes, and again, it's white who has the IQP in these middle games. After castle short, if you go knight c6, then suddenly we are seeing this kind of pawn formation, right? White has the double pawns, but soon they will get rid of one of those double pawns, like in this case. Then you go queen c7, rook d8, e5 breaks are one of those ideas in the middle game. Here we see a whole different pawn structure. After knight c6, if white takes on d5 in this position, black can get the IQP in this pawn formation, right? After takes, it's black pawn on d5 that is isolated. And black is playing with an IQP structure. Just to show you the bigger picture of the basic terrain of pawn structure transformation and possibilities, you see, I show you 3 different pawn formations that warrants a whole different approach in the middle game that Nimzo-Indian can give you. That's why it's not like one size fits all approach in Nimzo. You can choose your own transformations if you play smartly in those positions. Also, white has some choices, yeah, to transform the pawn structure in a certain way. And that's why in today's video, I want to focus on a very interesting variation in Nimzo-Indian defense, namely Hübner Variation with early c5. You don't castle short directly, you keep it flexible with your king's position, but you directly strike in the center with the move c5, put some pressure and prepare the move knight c6. Hübner Variation, to my mind, is one of those very interesting strategic battles because you will soon see what I'm talking about. Here, one of the main moves for black is to take the knight unprovoked with the bishop, right? And now we are giving this pawn structure to white. We are creating this very pawn structure. Then our game plan becomes d6 followed up with e5. This is what we'll be speaking about in today's episode, folks. Please stop the video, take a stock, and try to understand Black's basic claim and basic philosophy by taking this position and playing the Hübner variation of the Nimzo-Indian defense. Why this variation? Because we are setting the pawn structure, right? Especially after d5, knight e7, the pawn structure is fully set in the center of the board. This becomes easier to analyze, easier to lay the plans, right? We can talk about this pawn formation in terms of imbalances. What does white get? What does black get? And so on and so on. Once again, just to tell you what we are speaking about today, we are talking about the Hübner variation with early c5, and the whole claim for black is to give up the bishop pair, give this unopposed bishop to white, but the basic philosophy, as I said, is to limit the bishop by the pawn fall. That's the first philosophy behind this variation. Yes, you have the bishop pair, but the basic claim for black is they are ineffective in this very blocked pawn center. And if you think about it, bishops don't like when the center of the board is clogged and blocked by pawns in chess, right? They want generally fluid and open centers. But also, look, black is placing most of their pawns on dark squares, which is ultimately going to limit white's unopposed bishop. Okay? Never forget this. Look at the big picture. Because if you understand, truly understand the gist of an opening, then you can find the right moves in certain junctions. So, in the bigger picture, we want to use our pawns to limit the dark square bishop. Also, these are double pawns, right? They are long-term targets for our pieces. In terms of pawn structure, black is better, white is a bishop pair, but how can you show the strength of the bishop pair? Also, by playing d6 and e5, we activated our bishop, right? That's a good bishop in this pawn formation. Imagine you'll be playing with the bishop on e7, that will be a terrible piece, right? That's why you first play bishop b4, took, and only then formed this pawn triangle on dark squares. And meanwhile, even this bishop is a tall pawn in white's position. Almost serves like a pawn with really no prospect whatsoever in this position. Let's start from this historic game between Najdorf and Hübner from 1971 to show some patterns, some useful patterns in those structures, okay? So, Najdorf plays g3 to ultimately prepare the move f4, the main pawn break that could strike in the center and maybe to activate the bishop in this position. They want to really make use of the bishop on c1. That's why Hübner plays h6, right? To limit the piece, stopping moves like bishop g5 in this position. But also, you will soon see there's one more point to this move. Knight h4 is on the board. Now white is really ready for f4, right? That's their intention. They want to create play on those dark squares to immediately disturb our pawn structure and activate their bishop. Thus, black plays g5. Very surprising looking, but since the king hasn't committed yet on the king side, you will soon see my point, guys. This is a very useful move because you are stopping f4 with tempo on the knight. Knight g2 was chosen in the actual game. If they play knight f5, folks, this trade only helps us, right? Because they are filling the outpost square with a pawn in its position. Yeah? After e4, bishop takes f5 on the next turn, black is gaining a pawn with a much better position. So after g5, white cannot go to f5 with the knight. That's why they drop back the knight to g2. The knight is a terrible piece, but has some potential on e3. White might still go f4 or h4 in its position. But again, never forget, we don't commit our king on the king side yet. That's why first he plays queen a5 to attack the pawn. After queen b3, he goes bishop h3, right? Because he's stopping the move h4 by white by gaining tempo on the knight as well. Plus, this move prepares castling long. Guys, look at this. Hübner plays the move castle long. Most of us would think, hey, this king is so unsafe. The b file is semi-open. It's a chess crime to commit to the queenside castling. And he says no. And that's one of the first patterns we will learn in this episode. The king is quite safe on the queen side. Plus, you're connecting your rooks for the ensuing pawn storm on the king side. Can you see? I made several videos about this, of course. When the king's castle on opposite flanks, the game becomes pawn storm, right? Now the game plan becomes, how do I open up lines on the king side to attack your king? And black's basic claim is it's easier for black to attack the white king here than the white pieces to attack the king on c8. Please observe, the bishops are useless in this position. There is no way for white at all to activate their bishops and place them on functional squares in this very pawn formation. This is Hübner Variation gist, maybe first crucial pattern you must understand. Yes, they can go rook b1, that's a game continuation, but Hübner simply draws back the queen to c7 and claims these are your only two pieces that can put pressure on the queen side, but I will defend very easily, even with moves like king b8 and bishop c8 if it comes down to it. I will defend my pawn on b7 and show me your cards. You can't bring reinforcements to the queen side, right? Please look at the big picture. That's the basic claim of black in this pawn formation. Najdorf goes f3, guys. He wants to bolster the pawn on e4. After f3, he goes king b8. He potentially prepares the bolstering move bishop c8 to guard the main weakness as well. Rook f2. The rook might go to b2. The problem is black can easily cover the b7 point in this position, guys. Rook g8. Why? Because black wants to play h5, h4 or g4 to open up lines, but if you play h5, you drop the pawn on g5. Thus, Hübner goes rook g8, guard the pawn, and black is ready for the pawn storm. Can you see it? Black's basic claim is that his storm is coming first and easier to be established on the king side. Knight e3, again, we have full cover on this f5 outpost, so that knight is also useless in this position. Look at this. Hübner drops back the bishop to c8 and bolster the main weakness on b7. The bishop also gets out of the way of the pawn storm. Now these moves are coming potentially on the king side. King f1, well, Najdorf sees the danger. He wants to flee the king. And then Hübner plays the move rook f8, guys, so that he can prepare the move knight e8 very, very soon. So the rooks are connected on f8 and g8. Okay? You see, Najdorf sees the danger. He wants to maybe bring the king to the center of the board to escape this storm. He's not ready, guys. Can you see? f5 is coming potentially on the next turn, and knight paves way for the pawn. Knight f5, Najdorf sees that. The only way to stop f5 is to get knight f5 themselves. The problem is, after takes, you just nullified the outpost square with the pawn, right? You fill the outpost on f5 with the pawn, and that, of course, is useful for black. Again, never forget the big picture. The bishops are useless in this position. The bishops have no function whatsoever in this position. Please, guys, please look how the wall of pawns are limiting that bishop. That's the gist of Hübner Variation. Never forget the big picture. That's our philosophy. Our beautiful pawn chain is blocking and making and utilizing this bishop on c1 completely in this position. White will love to have a knight on e4 in this position. The problem is all the knights are exchanged off. So white cannot use this beautiful e4 point as well. And if you keep on waiting, black has some ideas to open up the king side ultimately in this position. He goes g4 to bolster the pawn. What's the problem? That's a hook pawn. And how do you make use of the hook pawn to open up lines? You're a great player if you found the plan of rook h5 and h5 is coming and black is creating play on the king side. But ask yourself, how can white improve on the queen side? It's not easy at all. Because even though your pawn can, let's say, reach a6, I can easily push b6 and lock down the queen side completely. So bishop e3, the bishop is still useless. The bishop has no function whatsoever. So he focuses on his plan on the king side. Very quickly I will show you the moves, guys, because we don't want to delve into every single move. But please observe how he's playing. Black is not in a hurry. The knight is also coming to this very interesting post on a8 very, very soon. It looked like a strange move, but that's one of the best moves in the position. At first sight, it looked like a chess crime to play a move like knight a8 and let your knight buried by the pawn on a5. But the real function of the knight on a8 will be understood very, very soon. His basic point is that this knight can single-handedly defend the queen side after moves like b6, while black is focusing on their own play on the king side or in the center of the board, guys. Again, never forget, those bishops and rooks are useless. They can't attack the king on b8. So yes, our king is still safer in this pawn formation. Queen d8 puts pressure on the pawn on a5, queen a3, rook h7. He's taking his time. He's taking his time and now plays the move b6. That's why he played the move knight a8. Knight a8 is bolstering the pawn on b6 in this position. After, let's say, some moves, rook b7 also paves way for defense and opening up the b file potentially. Takes. This knight is a beautiful creature. Nobody can chase away this knight from b6. The king is so safe. Everything is well guarded. The knight is also well guarded by the black pieces. The knight also puts pressure on the pawn on c4 in this position, tying down the bishop. Never forget, those bishops have no function whatsoever, and black already has the advantage in this position. Rook a1, again, there is no pressure at all because I defend everything, so he focuses on the king side action with move queen h8. Look how long he's preserving this pawn tension between those pawns, guys. You see, Najdorf fleed the king to the queen side, anticipating the action on the king side, but now he enters, right? He slowly enters the king side with rook h2, and the queen also activates ultimately. Again, black king is safer than the white king, and that's correct. Takes, queen h2. You see my point? The game is already in black's favor. Black is a winning advantage. I will show you how this game actually ended, guys. Knight a4, right? That was the final point of knight b6 idea. Now these are a couple of ideas. Rook b2 check and knight takes c3 fork. Devastating, right? The rook is now guarding our king on b8 as well. Everything is beautiful. Queen d2, they are paralyzed in guarding those squares. If rook b2, bishop c2, quite a passive position for white. And again, black is taking his time. Black is not in a hurry. Here, guys, he goes queen f4. And that's also important to realize in this position. Endgame is favoring black as well. He's welcoming this queen trade. If you take on f4, e takes f4 is correct, because now, please observe those weaknesses in white position. There is no way for white to hold this position. Everything is paralyzed to guard their pawns. Attack the pawn on c4, attack the pawn on c4 with bishop b3, the game is over. There is no way for white to stop bishop b3 and take on c4. Again, as I showed you, the gist of Nimzo-Indian is to exploit those double pawns deep in the endgame. So most endgames are also favoring us for that same reason, right? That's why he goes queen f4, very technical move indeed. Exchanges the queens, again, reaching an endgame where white's double pawns are a big misery for them. Puts pressure on c4, because even this bishop can later attack that pawn on c4, right? Weakness awareness. Never forget, guys, that bishop is a terrible creature. He takes his time, he keeps the bishops on the board, he improves his king, and then the final action begins, right? The final Nimzo-Indian pattern, full pressure on the weakness on c4. Double pawns are hurting white. It's almost like Zug's one, guys. That's the first threat. And the second threat is knight takes d5. Can you see it? Knight takes d5, c takes d5, bishop takes d3, and the game is over. White cannot parry both threats at once. Najdorf played bishop e3, bam, knight takes d5, and he resigned in the actual game. Najdorf resigned because if you take on d5, bishop takes d3, can you see? White has so many more weaknesses, guys, in their position. The bishop will chop off every single pawn on the king side. Black has an extra pawn to start with. That's also a pass pawn. The game is completely finished. Please look at the big picture. Please, even in the final position, please see how limited the white bishop is by black's pawn chain. Once again, big points I want you to take from this game is bishop pair is not always a strength. Bishops blocked inside those pawn chains, fixed pawn chains, can be quite useless to begin with. Finally, the bishop on c1, dark square bishop, could never activate at all in its entire game, and the king was so safe on the queen side. Black's storm on the king side had more potential than white's storm on the queen side. Look, for the entire game, only these two pieces could attack the queen side. They could not bring any other minor piece into the attack. And that's a very important pattern for Hübner players, so that you don't have phantom fears about white's initiative on the queen side. Now I'll show you the second game between Starotsis and Kuloats. Sorry about butchering their names, but they are both grandmasters. They're both very strong players, guys, okay? The second game will show us two other important patterns for Hübner players to know by heart, okay? So now white chooses the very same setup. Hübner Variation with knight f3, bishop d3. Here, black takes the knight unprovoked. Because if you don't take here, maybe white will play bishop d2 and not allow you to have double pawns. That's the basic idea behind taking on c3 and setting this pawn structure as soon as possible. White cannot prevent e5, and e5 is coming here, right? And now black sets this fixed pawn formation in the center of the board. Again, h6 to stop bishop g5 ideas, guys, and maybe potentially eyeing for g5 plans and so on and so on. Knight h4, white gets ready for the push f4, and now you know it already. g5 is the main move for black, maybe the only move to claim some slight advantage already in this position. Because if you make, let's say, a random move here, then f4 is on the board. If you take, and if you think g5 is winning a piece for you, I would say think again, because bishop takes d6, attacks the knight on f6, thus white is having a winning position. So that's also an important pattern, guys. Here, white can actually play f4, because you might think, hey, I will poke their pieces if they take. They say no, right? Very important to observe. Knight is loose piece as well. Our position gets destroyed in this case. That's why after knight h4, he doesn't allow f4. He plays g5 himself. Bam! Because the king is still in the center. The king hasn't committed yet on the king side. You know it already. In this case, they play queen f3, counter-attacking our knight on f6. If they play knight f5, folks, you know it already. Takes, e4 hits the bishop. Bishop takes f5 to follow. Black has a much better position already in this position. So after g5, queen f3 is tried by white. That's one of their main tries. In this game, he drops back the knight to g8. It looks passive, but again, the problem is the knight is now hanging, and after knight f5, I will chop your knight on f5. Thus, you filled the outpost on f5 with a pawn. That's a good thing for black, of course, right? Again, your bishops are limited. You don't have any knight anymore to exploit, let's say, this e4 outpost in the position, and the basic philosophy is the same. Your bishops are ineffective in this pawn formation. Always look at the big picture. But this knight has potential, as we saw in the last game, right? Knights are flexible pieces. They can change colors. Even in deep end games, they can go and exploit those weaknesses, and so on and so on. Okay? In this game, he played the move queen e2. Why? The opponent's plan. The opponent's idea, folks. Why did he play queen e2 here? What would white play if black doesn't make a move right now? Very important pattern for you. Yes, folks. By aligning with our king on e8, white prepares the move f4. Opening move, right? A pawn break that could activate the bishop finally in this position. Maybe even the rook slightly in this position. You don't want to allow f4 in this case. Your king is in the center too. Now, I want you to find a beautiful move. Beautiful pattern for black. This is a surprising pattern, but it's so beautiful once you understand the real point of it. You're a great player, folks. If you found this move, king d7. Bam! Nimzo-Indian will be proud. The king is having a shelter on c7. A little shelter will be safe like a baby on c7. So the king is escaping the e-file pressure. It also stops the move f4. Multifunctional king move. Also, as I said, there is no safety on the king side. If you play castle short, h4 is hurting us, right? Now your king is really exposed on the king side, and they're activating their bishop as a result. Thus, the king is much safer on the queen side. That's a hugely important pattern for Nimzo-Indian players, Hübner players, okay? a4. They anticipate king c7 ideas, and here in the actual game, king 7 is also a fine move, but he plays the move a5. Another useful pattern to know, this move fixes the pawn as a potential target. Later on, you can attack the pawn on a4, but you're also stopping white in pushing the pawn to a5 in this position. Okay? You might say, I'm giving some outposts like b5, b6. That's the least concern. Black has ways to deal with that. Also, notice that white has no knight in this position. If they have a knight, this will be a bigger concern to give this b5 outpost to white. But without knights, how can their minor pieces exploit this weakness? It's much more harder for white to exploit the local weaknesses like this on b5. Okay? f3, because they already see some potential like e4 for black, they are stopping that. King c7, right? The king has no function on d7. By going to c7, it also activates the bishop. The king is a very safe creature on c7. Bishop e3, guys. Never forget, the bishop is a useless piece. The bishop is lacking any pawn breaks to activate on the queen side. He goes b6 and he forms this wall of pawns again. Look at this, guys. See how the wall of pawns is forming, working like granite. The bishop is shooting on granite, as they say. Shooting on the wall of pawns. Our pawns are deactivating the bishop, and their pawns are deactivating their light square bishop. That's a beautiful imbalance. That's why I love those openings. Shows us beautiful trade-offs between different philosophies, different approaches to the opening. Okay? Please take a stock and evaluate this position. The machine is giving minus 0.5 advantage to black. I also think it's actually easier to play for black in this position. g4 was chosen by the white player because they are bolstering the pawn on f5. They're also stopping black from pushing g4 at some point. What's the problem? This pawn will serve like a hook pawn down the line for black to open up lines. Can you see it? It's always a give and take. Now we will use this g4 pawn to open up lines. Bishop d7, very typical move as well, very typical. Not only covering the b5 weakness, but also tying down the rook by attacking the weakness on a4. Hugely important pattern for Nimzo-Indian players. That's an excellent bishop, by the way. King g2, queen g8. By defending the pawn on g5, black anticipates the move h5, right? Again, if you play h5 directly, then you lose the pawn on g5. You don't want that. So first you play queen g8, and everything is set for the storm of h5. Again, our king is safer. Please observe. Whose king is safer, guys? Can you anticipate the ensuing attacks on different flanks? I would say there's a much bigger potential for black to attack the white king than the white pieces on the queen side. And again, we are seeing a pawn storm position. Pawn storm meaning that the kings castle on opposite flanks, and that's the basic spirit of this middle game. h4 was chosen by the white player. Again, by taking on h4, black gets ready for opening up lines on the king side. h4 doesn't help white a bit on the king side. If they don't play h4, what are they doing? I mean, how can they organize an attack on the queen side, right? They are lacking manpower to attack our king. Let's say rook b1, h5 is on the board. h5 is on the board. Actually, we can even play queen h7, potentially eyeing the opening of the h file. White needs to react to our attack on the king side. They need to go back with moves like rook h1. They should forget about their attack on the queen side. Black is playing with the full initiative. Black is asking all the questions, not to mention potential pawn break down the line of e4 and so on, right? We have several ideas to create more play in the center or on the king side, while our king is very safe. Queen g8, h4, very quickly guys, I will show you the segment. Takes, king h1, rook e8. Black is asking all the questions, as mentioned. Queen h2, they are reacting to black's ideas on the king side. Rook b1, knight h7. The knight is eyeing this g5 square as well. That's a beautiful point. Knight g5. Bishop c2. They are guarding their weakness on a4. Our king is so safe on the king side. Knight g5. f4. Takes, takes. Takes, takes. Queen f6. I will show you one more pattern, guys. It's coming. It's coming now. Bishop d3. Knight e4 by black. And it looks like in this position, you just created a loose piece on e4. And you allow the move queen b2. It looks like a cold shower from black, because by attacking the pawn on b6, asking a huge question to us, right? Because the rook is tied down on that loose knight. And how else can you defend the pawn on b6? It's so hard. It's so hard. If you play rook b8, then the knight is lost. It looks like black blunder, right? It looks like knight e4 was a blunder in my clam checklist. This was a loose pawn on b6. And now you create a loose knight on e4. And you allow the move queen b2. And here comes the pattern. Critical pattern for all of us to know by heart. There's only one saving move for black in this position. There's only way to continue this game. Please stop the video and find the move that was found by the Grandmaster. You're a great player if you thought about the umbrella. b5 is the only move. By playing b5, you're stopping the queen b6 idea, but also, very importantly, you're forcing an exchange on b5, and you're letting white to fill the square with the pawn, and now they are closing the entire file. That pawn serves like an umbrella, like a shield covering your king. That's a beautiful chess pattern to know by anybody. Great defensive pattern. I created an entire video about 6 essential defensive patterns everybody should know, and umbrella was one of them. Very important, guys, okay? Otherwise, you're lost. Rook b8, the knight is lost, white wins. b5 is the only way to play the attack, but also you're forcing the closing of the b file. Your king is very safe suddenly. Knight g3 check, black focuses on their attack on the king side. Black won the exchange, because if you take my knight, then your king is totally open. Queen h4s are coming, will take on g4 on the next turn. The rook is also activated on d file. Our attack is starting first on the king side, yeah? For example, queen takes g4. This game is a disastrous position for white. Their king is so exposed. If you check my king, the king is the safest king in the world, right? Again, umbrella. Their pieces are ineffective on the b file. Please observe this, guys. That's a beautiful chess pattern. After queen b2, b5, takes, knight g3. He lost the exchange, and black later on won the game very easily. The king is so safe on b7. Here, black played the beautiful move c4, the winning move, because if you take my pawn, can you see? Those bishops become loose. They are both loose. Attack 0 times, guard 0 times. Thus, the move is rook e4. And black attacks both bishops and wins material, and he won the game with this double attack. So, 2 new patterns we learned from this game, okay? 2 new patterns we learned from this game. First of all, in this pawn transformation, After queen e2, we need to understand that a floor is coming and our king can simply flee to the queen side. Basically just only 2 squares, yeah? We can flee to c7. It's all about observing this c7 as a safe haven for black. Of course, for that you need to learn these patterns. You need to see some patterns like this. And now in your next games, these ideas will pop up to your brain a little bit easier and faster, okay? The king was so safe for the rest of the game on the queen side. Second pattern, we can fix the pawn on a4 as a potential target, especially in the absence of knights. White cannot exploit this b5 outpost nicely. One more pattern, see how black saw the pawn on g4 as a hook pawn and activated their pieces by pushing h5. Very typical attacking pattern in pawn storm positions. And the final very important pattern, the pattern of b5, forcing the closing of the b file. Yes, you see the function of the bishop as well, because if the bishop wasn't here, then they could take with the queen in this position. But because of the bishop's presence on d7, they need to take back with the pawn, and this closes down the entire file. Anatoly Karpov game. Karpov was a great practitioner of the Nimzo-Indian defense as well. He played it in many different ways, but I will show you one game of his that shows us Hübner patterns. He plays c5, d5. You see, now we are reaching a similar position from different move order. Instead of e3, white chose the move bishop g5 against Anatoly Karpov. And then we'll see very similar pawn structure transformations. Already here, you see it, right? Black is setting for the same pawn chain. Black is setting for the same pawn structure. First, he takes on c3 unprovoked, and then he goes e5, and he sets this beautiful pawn structure. Now, the basic philosophies are the same. Instead of waiting for white to play e4, Karpov plays the move e4 himself in his position. If they take on e4 and claim the knight is pinned, black will say, I unpin with tempo on your bishop, and now you're losing a piece on the next turn. Okay, that's why after e4 they can't take bishop c2, but g5 is coming, and Anatoly Karpov's basic point is the bishop is still ineffective on g3, despite the fact that it's just shooting on my backward pawn on d6. Very interesting concept as well to remember for the black players. Queen e7 guards the pawn while also preparing knight d7 to e5 ideas. Very important pattern as well. When the bishop is on g3, if you play knight d7, you lose the pawn, right? Thus, first queen e7 also bolstering the pawn on e4, which limits that knight, by the way, also preparing knight e5 ideas. Karpov plays like Karpov. h4, they want to exploit the alignment. Thus, Karpov goes rook g8. Very important pattern as well in those positions that you guard your pawn with the rook. You welcome this exchange. This rook is ineffective, by the way, guys. The rook has no invasion on the 7th rank. It can go to h6, but everything is well guarded in the position. Black objectively has a better position, right? Has better prospects in the long run. Look at the bishop as well. Terrible piece. The knight is also terrible on e2. Only e2 is left, but from e2, the knight is still a horrendously bad piece in those structures. Again, knight e2, the knight has no potential whatsoever in this pawn formation. Karpov focuses on their plan with knight e7, queen b1, and here we reach interesting position. If I ask you, what are your observations and plans about the king on e8? How are you going to park your king in this position? Where is the safe haven for the king in this position? Folks, you tell me. You tell me. Yes, Karpov goes king d8, guys. Beautiful Nimzo pattern. In the last example, we saw king d7, c7. Here, Karpov is reaching c7 soon using the d8 square. Again, safe haven on c7. The king will also bolster the weak pawn on d6 from that spot. a4, white wants to go a5 and put some pressure on the queen side. That's why Karpov plays the move a5 himself in this position. He's stopping the move a5. Just like in the last example, he fixes this pawn as a potential long-term target as well. After a5, rook a2, they want to attack the queenside points using the rook. The problem is king c7 is a very, very safe haven. Rook h6. Again, white activates all of their pieces, it seems. They put some pressure, but everything is well guarded. Look how Karpov is defending every single piece in this position. He plays very prophylactically. Everything is well guarded. It looks a little bit passive for black right now, but white has no potential whatsoever to improve. They will be stuck at some point, and from then on, black will take over this game. Here Karpov shows us one more defensive pattern that you can learn. He wants to ultimately tuck his king on a7, but the king will be, let's say, burying the rook on a8. So first, he gets the rook out to a6. Beautiful move, prophylaxis. it defends the weakness on d6 as well. Potentially, the rook can later go to b6 and challenge the b file. Plus, now he's setting up for this little shelter for the king on a7. Look at this. White puts some pressure. Everything is well guarded. Karpov doesn't care about White's initiative. He says, you only have these two pieces on the b file. That's the maximum pressure you can put on me on the queen side, and I guard everything. The rook guards here. The rook guards there. The rook also puts pressure. Potentially, it can go to b6 down the line. The king is so safe on a7. Please look, guys. It's a safe heaven for the king on a7. As mentioned, there is no way for the knight to ultimately appear on this b5 outpost as well. It's almost impossible for White in this very pawn formation to get the knight on this b5 outpost. So they start retreating in this position. Queen b3, knight g4 by Karpov. Can you see the point? By moving the knight from f6, he guards the d6 point as well. This was the final point of rook a6, because otherwise you could be taking my pawn on d6 in this position. That's a fine function of the rook a6 move. Beautiful Karpovian multi-purpose move looks like this. And now, of course, he plays f5. He bolsters his beautiful pawn center. He sets up for potential f4 down the line, not to mention this beautiful juicy e5 outpost for Karpov's knights. Please look at the big picture, guys. Their pieces are terrible. Terrible knight, terrible bishop, and even the bishop is ineffective on g3. The rook is neutralized as well. The king is in the center too, by the way. And yes, you have these two pieces, but I defend everything on the queen side. That's why, if you ask Engine is giving a winning advantage to black. Incredible. Equal material, black is completely winning, strategically winning position for black. Black did not do something special. They were acting very carefully, prophylaxis to its full, and now it's black's turn to play in this position. King d1, they see the danger, they want to flee the king, rook b6. Final point, Karpov neutralizes the opponent's only active rook. Beautiful, right? This rook was your main active piece, and now after this exchange, White is lacking manpower even more on the queen side to attack the king, and he goes b6. Look at this, guys. He goes b6, because if he went b6 here, right, it would be a chess crime, because the rook will be buried on a6. So first he exchanged off those rooks, and only then he goes b6. That's a beautiful Hübnerian, Nimzo-Indian pawn formation for you, right? I'm sure you'll get great satisfaction. Again, look at White's minor pieces. The knight is the worst knight in the world. Has no potential whatsoever. The bishop is the worst bishop in the world as well, hemmed in by their own pawns as well as the pawn chain. The bishop is also not doing anything. It can be even utilized even more with moves like knight e5, not to mention very soon you will see ideas like f4 in this pawn formation. Bishop b3, bishop a6, typical Nimzo move, putting pressure on the weakness on c4, thus tying down the opponent's bishop even more. Knight c1, well, the knight was already quite terrible. Even on c1, the knight has no potential whatsoever in this position. Can you see it, guys? Because of the presence of the pawn on c3, the knight cannot use that square to jump to this b5 outpost either in this position. So terrible pieces. Finally, knight e5 is on the board. Maximum pressure put by Karpov pieces. Also attacking the weakness on c4. White cannot hold this position, guys. Finally, everything is tied down on that weakness on c4. Beautiful Nimzo-Indian patterns for us. f4 directly was also winning, but it involves more deeper calculation. Karpov plays Karpovian move. Simple move. Knight g6. Why? Because at some point, he will play the move f4. This knight supports the f4 break that will completely destroy White's structure on the king side. Again, please take a stock and look at the beautiful position of the black pieces. King d2 was chosen, knight f6. If you play f4 directly, then the knight will be hanging, right? So Karpovian retreat, simple retreat, and now nobody's stopping the move f4 anymore. Karpov plays simple chess. After queen d1 comes f4, and white player resigned in his position because the entire thing is collapsing on the king's side, right? If you take, I can take back. There's the bishop going, bishop h2, comes e3 check, right? Can you see it, guys? If you take on e3, then knight e4 checks are on the board. This is going to be destroyed. The position just cannot be holdable by white. Comes the knight fork, not to mention those ideas. This is just game over. So e3 is a beautiful clearance move as well. You're clearing the e4 square for your knight. And also, yeah, if they take on e3, the game is over. If king c2, I can even take on f2. I can do these checks. the game is totally finished after e3. And after f4, if you drop back to h2, it is quite terrible as well. Rook h8 can also come to exploit the alignment, to put pressure on the h-file. White cannot improve their position from here, so we now won't even see this against Anatoly Karpov. So what did we learn from this example? To me, new patterns, even the bishop on g3 can be easily neutralized by the black pieces, by those ideas. Even the bishop in this pawn formation, the pawn on e4, was quite ineffective. h4 should be answered by rook g8 because your king doesn't gonna go to the king's side. Your king's ultimate destination is on the queen side. It looks like momentary activity for the rook, but everything is well guarded and protected, and future belongs to black in this pawn formation. The knight was the most terrible knight in the world, could never find a good spot in this pawn formation. Please look at this. Impossible to improve the knight in this structure. What else are we learning? Knight e5 potential was great for that piece. King c7 was a beautiful heaven for black. And again, fixing the pawn on a4 was a very good thing for black. Not to mention those new patterns that I showed you. One more idea behind a5 is at some point you can play rook a6 to b6. Once you place your king on c7, also guarding the d6 pawn, by the way, right? This beautiful pattern appeared to Karpov's brain because he saw similar patterns before many times in his life. That's a beautiful Karpovian game, by the way. It looks passive, but in fact, it's like a Python strategy. Everything is well guarded, and at some point, his play will begin, right? Can you see? From here, black is taking the game completely. White reached the maximum for their pieces, but they cannot improve any further, right? White plays all the pieces, all the heavy pieces, to good-looking squares, but Karpov says, okay, what's next? I defend everything, everything is safe, and now my game is starting. The main problem for white is, of course, that there was no future whatsoever for those two minor pieces. And once they drop back their pieces, once they on the back foot, Karpov never gives them the second chance, right? Here, Karpovian game starts. And now the rest was also quite beautiful. All the Nimzo-Indian patterns as well, exploiting double pawns, typical move. Knight e5, also putting pressure here, right? Karpov took over the game so nicely, and after f4, game over. Attack without sacrificing, by taking minimal risks, Karpov won the game purely by his strategic genius. Now in this final segment, I will show you two more games to highlight one more very important strategic tool you can use in the Hübner variation of Nimzo-Indian Defense. Very important for us to remember and know, okay? It will be called the art of exchanging pieces. You will soon see what I'm talking about, folks. Very typical pattern again. We took on c3, unprovoked in this position. Then we set this pawn formation very early on. And white also plays good chess so far. They didn't commit on the move e4 yet. They also moved the knight ASAP to be able to play f4 as soon as possible. That's quite a smart idea for white, by the way, to immediately create contact between those pawns, also to maybe activate their bad bishop and so on, right? Before black can consolidate their position. Castle short, castle short. As I said, you can even castle short in those positions. It's not a chess crime to do so. You will soon see what I'm talking about in this position, folks. Castle short, queen c2, rook e8. One more pattern is coming, guys. One more pattern is coming. They play the move f4. They will do so. They will definitely play the move as early as possible to create conflict on those dark squares and to activate their unopposed dark square bishop. And here we are taking on f4 to begin with to also activate a rook. And now e takes f4 was chosen in the actual game. Here comes my question to you. What are you seeing and what should be black's game plan in this position? Okay? What should be our game plan in this position? It's about certain exchanges favoring us in this position. It's also about preventing one important idea in this position. White's game plan might be to limit our pieces as much as possible while also activating their unopposed bishop, right? Right now the pawn is on the same color as this bishop. We want to keep it as such. We want to limit that piece as much as possible, and there's one move that does that. And you're a great player, folks, if you found the only move that gives black some advantage in this position. That's the move g6. Very typical. You're stopping the move f5 to start with, but the real point is this. Black to play, folks. Only move that gives black an advantage. Very important pattern for Nimzo players to play those pawn structures. And you're a great player if you found the move bishop f5. Exchanging off white's bishop pair, but very importantly, stopping f5 move from white but also activating the knight, but also keeping the bishop as a buried piece because of the pawn on f4. Your game plan becomes leaving white with a single bishop, colorblind creature on d2, and to have full blockade in this position and never allowing the move f5. Again, if you give the move to white, they will play f5 to create play for their rooks, to activate their bishop, and so on and so on. Thus, there's also one move that stops that. And what's the move? You tell me, guys. Yes, knight f5. Very typical, very instructive. You have full control on those light squares. You want to blockade those light squares. If they take on f5, you take back with the queen. And you're welcoming this endgame as well. And that's my point. Please evaluate this position. And please see how terrible that bishop is in this position. Hemmed in by its own pawns on c3 and f4. Plus, that's a weak pawn that our knight can later target with moves like this. Knight's a very flexible piece. Plus, we have other outpost squares like on e4, rook e2, and so on and so on. That's a very, very good endgame for black. That's a chunk that you should encode in this position. It all starts here, by the way, with bishop f5. If you don't play bishop f5, let's say you make a random move. White can even play moves like knight h4, and now it's much harder for us to stop the move f5. If you go to f5 yourself, then you're losing a pawn in the process, right? White is just winning a pawn in this position. So this was your last chance to prevent the opponent's idea, and that's a beautiful move, bishop f5. Again, in general, if the opponent has the bishop pair and you don't, in general, it makes sense to trade off a pair of bishops. In the first position I showed you, that bishop was the worst bishop in the world. Why? Because there was a pawn on e4 that was fixed on the same color as the bishop. Here, it's no longer the case. That bishop has influence in this game by supporting the break f5, right? That's why it makes perfect sense for black to play the move bishop f5. And again, you're leaving them with a terrible piece on c1. That's why it's a beautiful, strategic, recurrent chunk that you can apply to different positions that show deeper similarities. That's why I'm showing you these patterns in this video, folks, okay? Queen d7 again, not directly taking the bishop on d3, but preparing for the right exchange. White cannot even stop this trade because the bishop is pinned, right? There's no bishop e2, for example. The queen is hanging. That's why this is a very powerful exchange offer by black. Here, if they take with the rook in this position, then we have other ideas like knight g6 to attack the rook and exploit potentially this e5 outpost. In this pawn formation, this e5 square has become a weak square. No white pawn can control that square in this pawn formation, and that's also a long-term advantage for black. Not to mention the backward pawn on e3, which is also limiting their bishop in this position. So with best play, black is also having a better position here with moves like knight g4 to immediately attack the pawn on e3, not to mention eyeing this beautiful outpost on e5. Queen d7, knight h4, takes, knight f5. Very beautiful move from a strong player. Knight f3, they refuse the trade. Maybe they will later on chase away the knight with g4 and f5 and so on. And black will never allow that, guys. Rook e7, very simple chess. There is only one open file. So black simply sets up for the doubling of the rooks on the e-file. The claim is very simple. The bishop is useless. And I will improve further. I have a much better pawn formation. Thank you so much. Right? Static advantages belong to black here. Doubling up, challenging the open file. There is no g4, by the way, because my knight is covering that square, guys. And here comes one more pattern. He completely stops the move g4 by playing h5 himself. Very important pattern too. He is stabilizing his beautiful knight on f5. Now nobody can disturb that knight on f5, which means the bishop became even a worse creature because white cannot even play f5 in the near future whatsoever. They're playing with a terrible piece for the rest of the game. Not to mention even this knight has no forward squares from that position. King f1, king g7. I will show you very quickly how the game ended, guys. Black could have played in different ways. Queen a4, very nice as well, to attack those weaknesses and tying down the white pieces. Yeah, takes, very simple chess. And here comes a tactical shot. Black to play and win a pawn. I will let you to find this, guys. Black to play, please stop the video, and you have a tactic that wins a pawn in this position. And you're a great player if you found the move queen takes c4. Game continuation, guys. By taking on c4, black is winning a pawn because after queen takes comes this knight fork. And knight will take the queen with a completely winning advantage. Not to mention, that pawn is also weak, is hanging. White cannot even prevent this. Black is completely winning this endgame. So after queen takes e4, black won the game easily. Just to show you the same idea in a different game, just to show you the same idea applies. Grandmaster game again, Nimzo, Hübner Variation. We've seen this all before. Unprovoked capture on c3, d6, e5. We got our pawn formation. Here, white refuses to play e4 again, just like in the last game. He's eyeing for ideas like f4, castle short. That's also a safe move for black in those positions. g6. We're already setting up those ideas, by the way, guys. f4, you take on f4. If they take with the pawn, you tell me the next move. Black to play, there's only one move that gives black a clear advantage, and that's move bishop f5. You saw it already, right? You're fixing the pawn on dark squares. You're exchanging off their bishop, thus removing the bishop pair advantage from white, but your game plan becomes full play on those light squares. Light square strategy is visible to its core in this position. Okay, they want to play g4 next. You stop it, you tell me. With the move h5, light square strategy to their fullest, right? Look how much control we have on those light squares. Meanwhile, their dark square bishop is terrible. White has no play whatsoever on the dark squares. It's as simple as that, in fact. That's the basic gist of the philosophy. Again, rook e7 followed by rook e8. Black plays simple chess. Very close to the game I show you, by the way, guys. We're almost following the same game in this position. Here he goes h4 even to completely clamp down on g4 and maybe even gain this g3 outpost for their knight. That's one more idea behind h5, by the way. At some point, you can push h4 to clamp on this beautiful weakness on g3. Please evaluate this position by looking at the strength of the minor pieces on both camps. Knight h5, very simple idea. Attacking those weaknesses, takes. Black is having a winning position by not doing anything special. And that's why I made a video about this, right? By playing logical and sound strategic chess, black intensified the imbalance that was favoring them. Black is completely winning in this position, guys. Queen e2, attacking here, attacking there, putting pressure here, putting pressure here, tying down the knight. Beautiful activation. Meanwhile, the queen is the worst queen in the world, right? a5, they want to create something on the queen's side. He just takes. He says you have nothing because the king is so safe on g7. And never forget, the bishop cannot join this diagonal in this pawn formation. That's also a very useful pattern. Because of the double pawns, because of the presence of the pawn on c3, which is fixed as a double pawn, the bishop can never activate on this diagonal. Okay? Queen c7 was tried. Knight g3. This game is totally finished. A single queen cannot do anything. Knight g5. Final attempt to create something. But black plays very simple chess. Queen e7. He says, thank you so much. Let's trade the queens because in the end game, I have an extra pawn. That's a pass pawn. And that's just completely a lost position for white. So just to show you how the game ended, knight f3, guard the bishop, knight b6. Very simple chess. The knight is going to b6 to attack the weakness on c4. Knight f1 fork, decide the game. White resigns. Beautiful game, right? f4 takes. They should have taken back with rook, by the way, guys. Just to make it more difficult for black to play bishop f5 exchange. Because here, if you play bishop f5, it's a mistake. Then you give the e4 move to white. You must be careful with black in this position, right? If you play bishop f5, they will not take on f5, but they will play e4. And now it's a better position for white because their bishop also got active with tempo. Okay? So, if they take with the rook, you play some other move. Most likely, not f5 to attack the pawn. Also, the square itself is weak on e3. You're welcoming this exchange. Exchange sacrifice never works for white in those positions, by the way, guys. Everything is safe and protected. Rook e8 followed by rook e5 is coming. Your king is very safe. Okay? So knight f5 is a very safe move. If you don't like that, you can even play the move knight g4. Very typical. Knight is eyeing those weaknesses. That's a weakness. That's a second weakness. You can park your knight on this beautiful e5 outpost. And again, the king is very safe. The bishop is quite passive. This is blunted on this diagonal. Black is having all the long-term cards as well in this position. But once they take with the pawn, almost always, it's a great exchange for black to play bishop f5. And the rest of the game becomes a strategic grind. Simple grind, basically. I'll leave you with this beautiful homework position. Those of you chess nerds know this position by heart, most likely. You must have seen this at some point in your chess life. Black to play. Famous game between Spassky and Fischer in their World Championship match in Iceland. Fischer also played the Hübner Variation of the Nimzo-Indian Defense. You must notice some similarities in the pawn formation here. The bishops are useless and so on. Black to play and win. That's a beautiful combination that forced Spassky to resign on the next turn. Please tell me the move and why that's such a powerful move for black in this position. I will post a link of this game on the video description so you can see the entire game and how it evolved to this position. Please summarize with your own words what you really learned from this video. Was this something that was eye-opening for you, that was surprising? Did you change some of your mental models? For example, are you now thinking differently about the bishop pair advantage in chess, right? Are you thinking differently about the king's safety in chess? Those middle games that I show you has real power in changing your conceptions and mental models about this beautiful game called chess. That's what it did to me when I was first watching and looking and analyzing those games. That's why chess is beautiful to my mind. It's constant trade-offs between different concepts, different ideas. We also connected certain exchanges, long-term decisions, and how they can impact the rest of the game. We always connected pawn play to piece activity as well. I show you some nice umbrella patterns too to improve your defensive skills and not to have phantom fears about white's initiative on the queen side, right? Remember that Karpov game? You just tuck the king on c7 all the way to a7 and so on. Beautiful constructions. If you can achieve that, then future belongs to you, right? Because of white's double pawns, white's structure is quite weak on the queen side. So never forget the big picture. Always connect to these big picture questions. Why are you playing this opening? What is your bigger goal? What is your basic claim and argument that supports your moves, right? Because if you truly grasp that, then you can find good moves, even though you don't memorize every single move by heart. Expecting your feedback. If you like this video, please give me a like and subscribe so I can keep on producing content that actually helps you get better in this beautiful game, folks. Please leave a comment as well about your ideas, about your reflections on this video. See you very soon. Wishing you all the best. Bye-bye.